So Jung's fundamental contribution, I would say, is his analysis of hero mythology. And I would say that's the fundamental element of his thinking. Now, the relationship between that and Nietzsche is fundamentally this. Nietzsche believed that once the religious systems collapsed, we would have to consciously produce our new set of values. But Jung believed that the psyche was the source of all value. And so that it wasn't a matter of creating new values, it was a matter of discovering the values that were already lying dormant and implicit within us. So, and the next thing I would say about that is, you all know this. You just don't know you know it. And so one of the reasons to be educated from a literary and historical perspective is that you can come to understand what you already know. Because if you don't understand it, then there's an element of your being, the element that knows it and acts it out, and there's another element which is sort of you as a personality that are completely at odds with one another. And that makes you weak. It makes you something that's divided within itself. Now, you're doing everything you can as a general rule to incorporate this information. Now, for a long time, it seems as if as long as we acted it out and represented it symbolically and didn't argue about the assumptions, it was more or less okay. But we're past that now. And in order for us to benefit from the same protective structures that our ancestors benefited from, we now have to understand what they mean consciously. And that's really what Jung was up to. What he was really trying to do was to resurrect deep religious representations from the dead, so to speak, and to make them conscious so people could align themselves with them again. Now, I'm going to show you something that's related to that. All right, now, so I'm going to show you something from Pinocchio. Now, this is an initiation ritual. It's a journey to the depths, so it's a journey to the underworld. It's the consequence of a collapse in previous personality and the disintegration of that previous personality into a chaotic state prior to rebirth. Now, what happens in Pinocchio, which by the way was released at about the same time that World War II was brewing, and which also contains one of the best representations of the individual motivations for fascism that I've ever seen anywhere. That's the scenes that are associated with Pleasure Island. Remember, all the puppet is trying to become a real boy, right? So he's a marionette to begin with. Something else is pulling his strings. Well, for Jung, that's your habitual state of being. Something else is pulling your strings. Even the idea that you're autonomous is the consequence of something else pulling your strings. And for Jung, what you needed to do was find out exactly who and what is pulling your strings and decide if that's the direction in which you want to go. And that's really what happens to Pinocchio, because we're going to watch Pinocchio, part of it, in the Pinocchio story. He starts out as a marionette. Now, he's a marionette made by a good father, because Geppetto is a good father. He's a good craftsman and so on. So he's a marionette with a benevolent puppeteer. But as soon as he develops some autonomy, then he becomes prey to forces that are elements of the demonic archetype. In fact, the worst bad guy in the entire movie turns into Satan himself at one point in the movie. He basically has horns and a bright red face, and he manifests himself as so terrifying that the coyote, wolf, fox, and the cat that are trying to corrupt Pinocchio are terrified because they get like they're criminals, they're petty criminals and deceptive and so forth, but when they get a look at who's pulling their strings, it's enough to terrify them. And so Pinocchio goes through a series of temptations of various sorts, including a Freudian temptation, and the Freudian temptation is to remain weak and sickly instead of becoming a real person, so it's an Oedipal problem. And another problem that faces Pinocchio is that he's offered false celebrity as a way of solving his life's problems, so he's offered the opportunity to become an actor, and what that means is a deceitful fake who's constructed a persona that makes him appear far more valuable than he really is. So the movie outlines two pathological modes of movement towards maturity. One being a phony, and the other taking the easy way out and hyper valuing all your pathology so that you become dependent. So anyways, and then another mode of pathological development is offered to Pinocchio, which is to do nothing but engage in short-term impulsive and destructive play. And that's on Treasure Island, but when he goes to Pleasure Island, he finds that it's actually ruled by demonic forces with faceless entities who are transforming all the pleasure-seeking marionettes to braying donkeys who are slaves. It's like... So, Pinocchio escapes from that, and he does it basically by jumping into the unknown, and that's where we're going to start our exposure to his initiation.
Jiminy. Jiminy. You all right?
Sure. I thought we'd never make it. Certainly feels...
Okay, so now you can imagine what's happened is he was on Pleasure Island and everything went to hell, fundamentally. And so he jumped into the water to escape from that, and that's equivalent to plunging into chaos. And so chaos was an escape from pathological tyranny. And now he's tried to go home. So this is the psyche, in its search for maturation, runs into an obstacle, which is the tyrannical element of the Great Father that it cannot cope with, and it trots home, runs home. It's a defeat. Typical part of a hero story is the initial defeat of the hero when he encounters usually either the terrible Great Father or the terrible Great Mother. So this is a retrogressive, Jung would call this retrogressive restoration of the persona. So it's sort of like maybe you're a well-adapted adolescent and you live at home and you're a happy adolescent and everything's good at home, and then you go out to try to be an adult and you fail, and then when you come back home you try to act like a happy adolescent again, but you're not. What you are, in fact, is an unhappy adult. And if you move back to the happy adolescent mode of being, then it's false and pathological. You can't go home again, another typical motif in literature. Now the cricket, I can't tell you everything about this story. I can tell you a couple of strange things about it. One is that the cricket is Jiminy Cricket, right? And the initials of Jiminy Cricket are JC. And Jiminy Cricket was a common Southern American mild form of cursing. It's the equivalent of Jesus Christ. And so you might think, and of course, the cricket is Pinocchio's conscience, and well, so then you might ask yourself, why in the world would a pejorative, mildly pejorative term for Jesus Christ be applied to a cricket who's guiding a puppet into the water to rescue his father from a whale? Why would any of that happen? And the answer to that is, you know why, but you can't say why. You can't say why you know, or what it is that you know. But the mere fact that it makes sense, and it does, is an indication from a Jungian perspective that you're operating at an archetypal level. You understand this. And so I could say, here's an example of why the cricket is a bug. Well, things bug you, right? We say that, things bug me. Well, you should do something about the things that bug you, because that's your conscience calling to you. It's destiny in some sense manifesting itself as an unconscious impulse. That really bugs me. Means, if you can, you should do something about it, because you think about it, man, there's a lot of things out there that might bug you, but lots of them don't, but some of them do. Well, why do those bug you and not the other things? Well, that's a complicated question, but one potential answer to it is that there's part of your psyche that's oriented towards further development. Jung would call that the self, and that's like the totality of everything that you could be. And it's a strange sort of entity in some sense, because it's partly potential, and it's potential that expands across time. But the way that your potential totality calls to you in the present is by placing things in front of you that are your problem. And they announce themselves as your problem, and they do that by bothering you. So then if you pick up the task of fixing the things that bothers you, then you find the pathway to further expansion of your personality. So, and that's what's happening with Pinocchio. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the Pinocchio movie, and that makes it incredibly sophisticated, is that despite the fact that the cricket is an avatar of Christ, so to speak, the cricket has things to learn just like Pinocchio. And so that's very cool, because it's so cool, it's so sophisticated, because it means that you do have a conscience that guides you, but until you establish a dialogue with it, both you and the conscience are immature. You have to establish a conscious dialogue with it, and then interact together in a manner that propels your development across time. And that'll stop you from being a marionette of forces that would make you a braying donkey who does nothing but slave away in salt mines. So, okay, so Pinocchio goes home. That doesn't work, and that's where we're going to start here.
Come on, let's get home.
Father! Father! I'm home!
We're home, Mr. Geppetto. Home again.
Pinocchio! I'm home today!
There he is, Mr. Geppetto. Home at last. Hey, maybe he's asleep.
Father! Father, it's me!
No, come here. Look, he ain't here.
He's gone.
Yeah, and figure.
And Cleo, too. Maybe something awful happened to him.
Don't worry, son. He probably hasn't gone far.
Okay, so what's happened there? Well, many, many things at multiple levels of reality simultaneously. And that's the characteristic of an archetypal story. So on one level, Pinocchio's too old to go home. He can't go home to his father because in some sense he's already transcended his father. So there are things, for example, that your father can't help you with, and the reason for that is that he doesn't know any more about the situation than you do, and he can't. And so that's where his knowledge limits out. So that would be sort of on the personal level. And then on the transpersonal level, which would be the deeper archetypal level, what's happening to Pinocchio is exactly what Nietzsche described at the end of the 19th century. Because remember that Geppetto is his creator, and now he's dead, he's gone. And so Pinocchio is bereft of placement, so to speak. His soul has been corrupted, and he doesn't know what to do about it. And when he returns to his family home, or when he returns to his tradition, what he finds is nothing. Okay, so then what happens? Well, this is another thing that you'll swallow with just no problem whatsoever. Well, this dove comes along that's sort of golden and glowing and drops a note right in front of him. Now, you may remember, and perhaps you don't, but the star from which the dove comes is a representation of the blue fairy. And the blue fairy is the positive element of the unknown in the Pinocchio movie. And so what it basically is saying that when you're despairing because your father has died and your tradition has nothing to offer, that the positive element of the unknown may provide you with a message about where to go if you pay enough attention. That would be an intuition. Or it would be the automatic attraction of your interest to a new thing by forces that you do not understand. So one of the real ways of coming to grips with the idea of the active unconscious is to understand that you cannot control what you're interested in. And so then you might ask, well, if it's not you, what is it? And if you think about that problem long enough, you'll start to understand what Jung was talking about, because that is the way that you can understand in your own life that the things that direct you as a being are not things that you consciously choose. In fact, they're not even things that you can consciously choose. They're directed by other forces. So anyways, the dove drops a message in front of Pinocchio and the cricket. Now it's the cricket that reads it, so it's the same idea as what bugs you so to speak. The cricket is the interpreter.
It's a message.
What's it say?
It's about your father.
Where is he?
Why, it says here he went looking for you, and he was swallowed by a whale.
Swallowed by a whale?
Yeah, uh-huh. A whale? A whale named Monstro.
Oh, he's
But wait, he's alive.
alive? Where?
Why, inside the whale, at the bottom of the sea.
Bottom of the sea?
Uh-huh. And, hey, where you going?
Okay, so now what have we found out? Well, we found out that God the Father and God the Father, the Creator, are not in fact dead, which is what Nietzsche pronounced, but alive in some weird way in this horrible creature at the bottom of the ocean. And so what does Pinocchio decide to do? He decides to go find him. That's actually what you're doing at university, by the way. For all the chaos that you experience when you come to university and all the uncertainty and all the doubt, what you're trying to do is to resurrect your dead father from the bottom of the ocean. And if you do that, you won't be a marionette. And if you don't, you will be.
I'm going to find him.
Pinocchio, are you crazy? Don't you realize he's in a whale?
I gotta go to...
Hey, Pinocchio! Wait! Listen here, son. What this monster...
Now this is very interesting because the conscience here plays a very dichotomous role. So on the one hand, Pinocchio is often ahead of his conscience, so to speak, so he's taking the leading role, and the dialogue is kind of choppy and neither of them know exactly what they're doing. But in this situation, it's very paradoxical because you can see Pinocchio's been half turned into braying jackass at this point, something you might well consider when you remember your adolescence. So in this point, the cricket, his conscience, does two things. It warns him how horrible this is going to be and how utterly dangerous it is, and then at the same time, it helps him prepare and goes along with him. And so it's quite comical, so watch what happens here.
Hell of a whale. Why, he swallows whole ships alive. Tie it good and tight now. And besides, it's dangerous. Why,
Bye, Jiminy.
Goodbye. I may be live bait down there, but I'm with you. Come on. Let's go. Look out below!
Okay, so I've cut this a little bit, but what happens in the movie is that he goes to the bottom of the ocean and he starts to ask about Monstro. And as soon as he asks any of the fish down there, the denizens of the sub-oceanic world, where Monstro is, they just run away. And so Monstro is he who cannot be named, right? And I'm sure you've encountered that in your reading before, right? That's the hallmark of, in the Harry Potter series. Right, see, now you've done it. Yeah. So this represents something so terrible that it can't even be talked about. Okay, so what happens is Pinocchio ends up not only at the bottom of the ocean, but he has to go to the deepest part of the bottom of the ocean where the most terrible thing rests. And so we're cutting to the point where he does that. So now you might ask, how did Geppetto get in the whale? And the answer to that is it's never really made that clear in the movie. But I can tell you some things about that, is that if you conceptualize your historical tradition as a personality, like a body of laws and customs, say, it's not alive. It's dead, right? Because it's composed of the past. And because it's dead, it can't come up with anything new. So if it encounters something new, it's stopped. And that's what's happened to Geppetto, is that he's engulfed by this entity that represents the absolute unknown, and he cannot figure out how to get out. And the reason for that is none of the things he knows So none of the things that history has produced as a body of knowledge are sufficient to deal with the fundamental problem. That doesn't mean they're useless. It just means that just like the puppet is lost without the father is also lost without the puppet. And that's the relationship between you and history, your history. When you study history, you think, well, you're studying a record of events in the past, and that's not right. What you're studying is the circumstances that gave rise to you as a being. And unless you understand your history in every way you possibly can, then you're an incomplete creature. You don't know enough to move forward. In the same way, your culture, being composed of dead fathers, so to speak, can't progress without you because you're its eyes. And there's an Egyptian story that features the god Horus, who I've talked to you about before, who actually resurrects his father from the dead by giving him an eye. So Geppetto can't figure out how to get out of this whale without help.
Not a bite for days. We can't hold out much longer.
So he's kind of pushing up tombstones there, you might note. All right, now something very sophisticated happens here. So, and I have to explain it to you at multiple levels at the same time. So now, Geppetto is hungry. And when the whale opens its mouth, a lot of fish come in. Now, one of the things I want you to think about, you can just put this in the back of your mind, is that one of the oldest symbolic representations of Christ is a fish. And all of his followers were fishermen. And so there's this weird relationship between the messianic figure who's at the base of, at least at the base of Christian culture, and the idea of things that are pulled up from the depths. Now here's what happens in this part of the movie. It's so amazing. So Geppetto is looking for fish. And the reason for that is he doesn't think he can get out of the whale, and so he might as well have some fish while he's in there. And so he's given up on getting out. Now what happens is that the whale swallows Pinocchio as if he's a fish. So Pinocchio is put into the same category as fish, and it happens to Geppetto a couple of times. He mistakes Pinocchio for a fish. You'll see. So what that means in some sense is that Geppetto can't distinguish between the fish that will feed you for the day and whatever it is that Pinocchio represents. And so you could think about Pinocchio as a fisherman instead of as a fish. And so you can think about it this way, and here's an old saying. If you give a man a fish, you feed him for one day, but if you teach him to fish, you feed him forever. And so the idea is it's better to develop the skill to acquire something than it is to have the thing. Now, what Pinocchio represents is, he's like a meta fish. I know this is a strange way of thinking about it. Geppetto's problem isn't that he's hungry. His problem is that he can't get out of the whale. And so what he's fishing for isn't something to eat. It's something that will help him get out of the whale. But he can't recognize the difference between the proximate solution, which is so that he'll just no longer be hungry, so he's got a very short-term outlook, and a solution to the much broader problem. So what happens is, the whale swallows a bunch of fish, and Pinocchio's in there, and Geppetto's fishing away, and he catches Pinocchio. And Pinocchio announces himself, and Geppetto tells him to be quiet, because he's interfering with him fishing, and then when he turns to hug Pinocchio, because he wakes up, he actually hugs a fish, and then he discards the fish. So then he figures out that Pinocchio's there. Then Geppetto decides that, well, they're going to have to live inside the whale. And it's another idea of his blindness at this point, because he's composed of the dead past, so to speak. So what Pinocchio does is start to destroy the ship itself, which is what they're floating in the whale, to start a fire. And the fire makes the whale mad enough to spit them out, and the whale then transforms itself into a dragon and tries to kill them, because it's a fire-breathing entity at that point. And so part of the understory is, it's better to figure out how to fish than to fish, or that more profoundly, it's better to figure out how to do something than to merely benefit from the thing itself. Pinocchio represents that which can do new things. So he's a hero, and he's willing to destroy part of the current order, that's the ship, in order to produce a new strategy that will actually free them from the whale. Now he wants to get his father out of there too. So that's what happens in the next 5 minutes, I would say.
I never thought it would end this way, Figaro. Starving to death in the belly of a whale. And poor little Pinocchio. He was such a good boy. It's hopeless, Figaro. There isn't a fish left. If the monster doesn't wake up soon, I'm afraid we are done for. Pinocchio! Pinocchio!
Father!
Pinocchio! My son!
Hey, Father! Here I am.
Huh? Oh, yes, Pinocchio! My, I'm so happy to see you.
Me too, Father. Figaro. Oh, Figaro. Cleo. Oh, Cleo. You're here too.
Yes, we are all together again. Oh, you are soaking wet.
Yes, Father.
You mustn't catch cold.
But I...
Okay, so now there's a shock here because essentially, in some sense, the entity that's going to provide the solution to this very complex problem has arrived on the scene. But it's quite damaged. First of all, it's been speaking improperly, right? So that's an adolescent representation. So it brays a lot of nonsense. And it's been corrupted in a variety of ways. And so, you know, to some degree what that means is that as you mature and you're moving away from your mere marionette status, your interaction with society, like Rousseau said, corrupts you in all sorts of ways. I mean, you're participating in that corruption, but it still happens. But in the representation in the movie, the truth of the matter is it doesn't matter if you've been corrupted to some degree, as long as you haven't absolutely sacrificed your capacity for true speech and vision. So, you know, that's a pretty hopeful message, because Pinocchio is by no means a perfect entity, but he might be good enough.
Pinocchio! Those ears.
Huh? Ears? Oh, these. Huh. Oh, that's nothing. I got a tail, too.
Pinocchio! What's happened to you?
Well, I...
Oh.
See, that's also an indication there of why people are often unwilling to form a representation with the, so to speak, form a relationship with the archetype of the Great Father, because to some degree the archetype is a figure of perfection, and the individual in relationship to that archetype is always pathologically flawed. And so the embarrassment of that realization, which is exactly what's happening to Pinocchio right now, is often enough to stop people from doing it. So what that would say, what that means in some sense, is that in order for you to mature in the fullest possible manner, you have to understand the manner in which you're deeply flawed in relationship to your potential as it might be historically determined. And that's a very bitter thing to do. You know, it's much easier, and people do this all the time, to engage in half-witted, formulaic, ideological criticisms of the system as a whole. It's like, you know, the probability that the system is more flawed than you is pretty damn low. So you might want to start with, you know, getting rid of your donkey ears and your tail and stop braying nonsense before you judge the entire, you know, historical process by which human beings have come into being. So, anyways, that's kind of what that means.
Oh, Geppetto has his little wooden head. Nothing else matters.
I gotta get in. My pal's in there. Come on, you big moose. Open up, I tell you. Hey! Cut it out. Oh, beat it, you buzzards.
Get out? Oh, no, son. I've tried every way. Why, I even built a raft.
A raft? That's it.
Huh?
We'll take the raft, and when the whale opens his mouth...
No. Now listen, son. He only opens his mouth when he's eating. Then everything comes in. Nothing goes out.
Oh.
It's hopeless, Pinocchio. Come. We make a nice fire and we cook.
Okay, so this is very interesting too, because so Pinocchio ends up being a master of fire. Well, you can think about that as, there is a book written a while back by a primatologist who also wrote Demonic Males, Richard Wrangham, and he talked about the origin of fire. And as far as Wrangham is concerned, we invented fire about 2 million years ago, and that enabled us to cook food, and that enabled us to swap intestinal length for brain. So if you look at a chimpanzee, you know, chimpanzees are like the ultimate in couch potatoes, right? They're about this high and they're shaped like this. They have this huge barrel body. And the reason they have that is because they eat leaves. And so they have to spend like 8 hours a day eating leaves. They will eat meat if they can get it. They have to spend like 8 hours a day eating leaves and just chewing them over and over, because like leaves, A, they don't want to be eaten, so they're pretty tough and inedible, and B, they don't have any nutritive quality to speak of. So the chimpanzee has to spend all of its time chewing, which is a rather mindless endeavor, all things considered. Whereas human beings, 2 million years ago or thereabouts, invented fire, and as a consequence of that, we could cook meat. And meat is incredibly energy rich. And it's easy to digest once it's cooked. And so the consequence of the invention of fire was that we're the way we are today. We could have a brain instead of a gut. And so the idea that Pinocchio's mastery of fire, and it's as something more than merely a means of cooking. That's how it started out, right? But you can think of our entire technological capacity as stemming from the mastery of fire. Now, the other thing you can think of, and this is very much worth considering, is that Pinocchio masters fire, and that turns the whale into a dragon. And so the idea there, too, is that, and this is an old idea, is that our technological prowess is something that makes nature itself angry. And, of course, you might say, well, do you believe this? And the answer to that is, well, how many of you have environmentalist leanings? And that's exactly the story that you're following, because you're still wondering about whether or not mastery of fire was in somehow against the natural order, and that it will end up in all of our deaths. And you know, that's a reasonable thing to worry about, but not mastering it was going to end up pretty badly too. So
That's it.
then we'll all eat again.
Great big fire. Lots of smoke.
Smoke? Oh, yeah, sure. A smoked fish will taste good.
Quick, some wood.
Pinocchio, not the chair.
Hurry, Father, more wood.
Oh, what'll we sit on if we...
We won't need it. We're getting out.
Getting out? But how?
We'll make them sneeze.
Make him sneeze? Oh, that will make him mad.
Well, it's about time.
It won't work!
Hurry, Father. Climb aboard.
We'll never get by those teeth!
Yes, we will.
Hey, which way you go? Wait for me.
Here we go.
Gesundheit.
We're going back!
No, we'll make it fast. Faster.
It's no use! We're going
We've made it.
Look! Now he is back! I told you he'd be furious! He's gone!
Where'd he go?
Look out! Hang on!
He's coming back. Hurry.
He's trying to kill us! Peterson!
So here what happens is that in the midst of this complete chaos, Pinocchio has a choice, and the choice is he can either save himself, which is a very, very selfish choice, and reduces him to an ahistorical individual because he has no relationship left with his father, or he can put himself at great risk and rescue his father, finish the process, stop his father from drowning, and complete the story.
Pinocchio, swim for shore! Swim for shore!
Father.
Save yourself!
Okay, so Pinocchio dies, and then his father brings him home.
My boy.
And so because he's rescued his father, the benevolent spirit of nature appears, resurrects him, and turns him into a real human being.
Prove yourself brave, truthful, and unselfish. And someday you will be a real boy.
So it's pretty funny, as far as I'm concerned, that the answer to Nietzsche's great question manifested itself in mid-1930s in the form of an animated child's movie. So, and that's an example. It's an example of a number of things. It's an example of how archetypes work. It's also an example of how artists are on the edge of discovery all the time. And they discover things they don't even understand. So, we'll see you next Tuesday.